So, Alan, welcome back. And yeah, great to see you again on
Thanks
the
for
other end
having
of the
me.
Zoom call. I was fascinated to read you co authored an article in the New York Times recently about the Sinaloa Cartel. So much has been going on there in the background that we haven't maybe been aware of on this side of the world. But yeah, tell us about it. I suppose a lot of it is to do with the pressure being put on Mexico by Trump along the border, the export by the Sinaloa of fentanyl and the effects that it's had on the US, and then the clampdown within Mexico as well.
Sure. So we'll just kind of start with the news. The One of the main factions of the Sinaloa cartel, run by the sons of El Chapo, two of whom remain in Mexico. They call themselves the Chapitos, the little Chapos, have struck up a remarkable alliance with one of their former sworn enemies in a rival cartel called the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. It's run by a guy named El Mencho. And these
Mm.
two groups have, for years, been engaged in often bloody and murderous competition over turf and profits in Mexico. But because of the reasons that you cited and others, the Chapitos found themselves in a quite vulnerable position vis-a-vis not only other cartels, but with warring factions within the Sinaloa
Hmm.
cartel itself. And so they decided to essentially get into bed with their former enemies. And as one smart analyst who we quoted in our story put it, it would have been like during the height of the Cold War if the East Coast had seceded from the United States and struck up a strategic alliance with the Soviets. That's kind of how counterintuitive this
Mm.
very risky move by the Chapitos was.
So, are we to understand that the Sinaloa cartel has essentially divided, and I suppose going back to when El Chapo was finally captured, and his number two at the time was a guy called Ismail Lambada, is that it?
Zambada. So yeah,
Zambada, Ismail Zambada.
I wouldn't even say number two. They were
Mm.
sort of the co-founders of the sort of, modern day iteration of the Sinaloa cartel. And back in the very early 2000s, they kind of struck up what was one of the most successful joint ventures in criminal history, right? And they kind of ran the Sinaloa cartel together for years. And as you pointed out, when El Chapo was finally convicted and sentenced to life in prison, he was sent away in 2019. His sons inherited his part of the business. And while the sons had always had a close relationship with Ismael Zambada, he's known as El Mayo. They call him
Hmm.
Mayo.
Hmm.
It was not always an easy relationship. Mayo was sort of their uncle, but very aware that they were also competitors. And so the Sinaloa cartel has had that rift on the sort of Chapo faction, Mayo faction for really the last, 6 years.
Right.
And so what's happened is that more recent events have really deepened that divide. And last summer, what was always a kind of fault line in the cartel erupted into open warfare. And we can get into the reasons for that in a minute, but in brief, it had to do with a remarkable act of subterfuge that was perpetrated against El Mayo by one of El Chapo's four sons, by one of the Chapitos. And this son kidnapped El Mayo in Sinaloa, forced him onto a plane, and flew him across the U.S. border into the hands of American federal agents and turned himself in in the process. And it was seen as a remarkable betrayal of Mayo by the Chapo faction, and it
Mm.
led to an eruption of violence that has really kind of been going on iteratively for a year, but has really picked up in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 months.
But I mean, that was a remarkable betrayal. And, how things untangled, really, I suppose, over those 6 years since El Chapo was jailed. And, you know, the sons realized that this uncle wasn't so much any longer a friend, but a foe, is what they created. They created these lines in the sand, the sons, out of ambition, I presume, along with other things. But to actually hand him over to the US is something that I'm sure doesn't go down well, does it, within their own ranks either. I mean, here it's called ratting or touting or whatever, but it's almost seen as like one of the sins of the underworld.
Um, so, there's so much to unpack from the kidnapping saga, which was the brainchild of Joaquin. What's his full name is he's
Walking out,
Joaquin Guzman Jr. is basically it, right? So
right.
the four sons, if we just set the table here, the four sons are Ivan, Archivaldo Guzman Salazar, Ivan's full brother, Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar. Those are the two elder boys from one of Chapo's many wives. And then the two younger boys are Joaquin and Ovidio Guzman Lopez, right? So they come
Hmm.
from a different mother, different wife. And there's always been both a generational divide between those two sets of full brothers, and also a kind of like a power divide. The older brothers sort of maintain a little more power, the younger brothers a little less traditionally. And just so, like to put the pieces on the table, um, Ovidio had been already in United States custody going back to, oh boy, 2023, I think he was extradited to the United States, and he is actually pleading guilty in 2 days on Wednesday to pretty sprawling drug trafficking charges, including some pretty serious fentanyl charges. But Joaquin Jr. had been at large in Mexico, and you know, um, as had all of his brothers, had quietly been in touch with American federal agents. And so, really, since Chapo went
Yeah.
away, there was a direct but quiet line of communication between U.S. law enforcement and the Chapitos, essentially saying, anytime you guys want to turn yourselves in, that is an option for you. You know, the idea being there's only a few sort of end games in this business. You can wind up dead. You could wind up, in prison. Maybe if you turn yourselves in and come over to the United States, there is a way to at least make your imprisonment a little more comfortable and maybe a little shorter than it might have been. In fact, that same offer was extended to Mayo
Mm.
Zambada. And there was a moment when it almost happened, but it didn't. So last summer, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you. So he sort of thought about it, you mean, but then decided
Oh,
against
yes,
it. Yeah.
there was extensive negotiations
Yeah.
between U.S. law enforcement, lawyers, and Mayo Zambada.
Right.
Extensive negotiations, and at the last minute, it just couldn't be done.
And is it kind of like a case of those older school guys, Chapo and Mayo? They're completely different to these youngsters who've come up. It's a case of succession, and maybe the young guys live different lives than they ever did, far more privileged. Do they have the head for business as such that the elders had?
I think there's something to that theory. Mayo is known. even in the old school of the Chapo generation, to be the oldest of the old school, right? He's the real tough nut. But even he really he went down the road pretty far with the negotiations, but at the last minute it couldn't, like, they couldn't reach an agreement.
But I mean, of course, like I just think as a human being, you'd have to consider it because you're literally like either going to be locked up if you're caught for the rest of your days. Will El Chapo ever walk free from prison? Will he die in prison? He doesn't even seem to have much of a regime or visiting, etc. So you're facing that, or you do a deal and you might get out a bit quicker. You might get to see your family again or something.
You
In
might,
the end of
you
the
know,
day,
yeah. Particularly if you're a younger guy, you
yeah.
know, you might walk free at the end of your life. So that, but that was always the play by U.S. law enforcement.
Mm,
And it was really an unusual um, coincidence of, a very small group of creative U.S. agents who really thought outside the box. And, this particular group, that there was this line of communication that had been open for a very long
mm,
time.
mm,
And so last summer, Joaquin Jr. Decided that he was going to undertake this sort of remarkable effort to bring not only himself across the border, but bring a big fish with him in order to sweeten the deal, so to speak. And that turned out to be Mayo Zambada. And I think that there were any number of considerations that went into that. One, Ovidio, Joaquin's full brother, was already in U.S. custody. So there might be some ability to help Ovidio's future by, Joaquin turning himself in with Mayo Zambada in tow. At the same time, I think the brothers who remained in Mexico, Jesus Alfredo and Ivan, they saw this by taking Mayo Zambada off the table as good for business, right? You're
mm,
eliminating a rival while at the same time helping the plight of your half brothers. So there were
mm,
any number of forces that sort of made this move a smart one with obvious, there were costs involved, right?
mm,
Ovidio and Joaquin will not walk free. They will serve some time. Remains to be seen how much. We'll see. Um, but the way in which Joaquin lured Mayo Zambada out of hiding was itself a testament to the ambiguous nature of the relationship between the Chapitos and Mayo Zambada. So Mayo Zambada is as wily as they come, uh,
mm,
but there was a certain level of trust there that he allowed himself to be drawn into a situation created by Joaquin Jr., where he was not moving with his full complement of security guys, and essentially allowed himself to be duped into abduction.
mm,
Um, and then once that happened, they were brought over the border. And Joaquin had actually, before he came up with the plan of luring Mayo Zambada, and putting him on this plane, there were actually other botched plans, or ones that never came to fruition. At one point, Joaquin had an idea that he was going to invite Mayo Zambada out fishing somewhere on a boat, and they were going to stray into international waters, and then they were going to, like, sail up to like a U.S. Coast Guard vessel or something like that and do the handoff like that. But it ended up being this sort of, he lured Mayo down from Mayo's mountaintop retreat with the ruse of settling a dispute between two local politicians in Sinaloa. Remains an open question about whether, those politicians were in on the con or whether they too were duped. I think that
mm.
is something that is, sort of actively debated, and that I know U.S. law enforcement has been investigating. Regardless, Mayo was caught unawares. He was essentially, subdued, put on a plane, and boom, he was across the border to El Paso, well, to an airport directly outside El Paso. It's actually in New
Mm.
Mexico, very quickly, and the FBI was waiting for him.
And that was the end of him as we know him. Did he have sons, or were his underlings more loyalists to him?
So, Mayo's sons, several of them have already been prosecuted in the United States. Perhaps most famously, his eldest son and heir apparent, Vicente Zambada, um, who turned himself in to U.S. authorities. Oof, that's over a decade ago, almost more than 15 years ago, and testified as a star witness, let's not forget, at El Chapo's trial. Another sort of motivating factor for the sons of El Chapo to seek
Mm.
vengeance on Mayo Zambada. Um, but one of Mayo's sons, who goes by the name Mayito Flaco, remains in Sinaloa and is a, you know, if if Chapo's remaining sons are kind of these, more urbanized, more privileged guys, Mayito Flaco's reputation, he remains of that old school mold, like a mountain guy, lives off the land, very quiet. And so, once Mayo Zambada was kidnapped and, taken to the United States, it was Mayito Flaco who really led the charge in the fight against the Chapitos. And Mayito Flaco made a fascinating alliance with a much lesser known but still powerful sort of subsidiary leader of the Sinaloa cartel, a guy whose name is Chapo Isidro, not to be confused with El Chapo. Um,
Hmm.
and so the two of them sort of joined forces against the Chapitos. And it was all of that pressure, plus the pressure you mentioned, brought to bear by the Trump administration, which we can talk about, that really led to the Chapitos striking up their strategic alliance with El Mencho and the Jalisco New Generation cartel.
Because of course this is all has all cost a huge amount of money, despite the fact they're making huge amounts of money smuggling fentanyl over the border, and whatever else they're up to. They're essentially running an army each side in this sort of infighting within the Sinaloa cartel. And I think people forget the kind of numbers you're talking about, because you probably are you talking each side over 1,000 kind of individuals working for the grouping.
I mean, yeah, I would say it's surely in the hundreds, could easily
Mm.
veer into the thousands. But, yes, you're paying salaries effectively for soldiers. You have to feed them, you have to equip them, you have to arm them, you have to buy the munitions, you have to buy the fuel. It's an incredibly costly battle. Um, and then, of course, the Mexican authorities have joined in this fight too, and have really sided quite heavily against the Chapitos. So whether that means they're for the Mayo faction, it's sort of in fact, yes, but they have really focused, the Mexican military has really focused its attention on the Chapitos faction. And so you've seen a number of major arrests of top um, Chapitos sort of sub-leaders and assassins and sort of military leaders in recent months. I remember over the winter, the people I talked to were all abuzz that, Ivan Guzman Salazar was like, on the run. They were going to get him within hours, if not a couple of days. And Ivan managed to evade capture. But there have been a number of close calls in the past few months to the point
Mm.
where I would say it was about a month ago. I had one quite knowledgeable person suggest to me that that Ivan and Jesus would, in all likelihood, be either dead or take the American bargain to come over, within a matter of, 2 to 3 months. So that was before this strategic alliance with Jalisco New Generation Cartel kind of came into being,
Mm.
or at least rose to the surface. And so, this was effectively a move of desperation by the Chapitos to stave off, their almost certain demise. And who knows whether it works in the end.
Yeah.
Clearly, they've made a deal with the devil here, but we shall see.
Exactly. I mean, it's quite extraordinary to see, it's almost like an earthquake going off from the top of this cartel is removed with El Chapo. The sons fall out with his right-hand man. They don't like one another, the jealousies, the rivalries, the ambition of the new generation comes along. And everything just really goes to it becomes such a mess, doesn't it? It's like you think by removing El Chapo, the jailing of him was going to be the best thing ever, and this was the beginning of the end of the Sinaloa cartel. But in actual fact, it just sent everything just shaking, erupting.
I mean, yeah, I think that's been the story of Mexican cartels since the beginning. In a sense, it's a story of all sort of organized crime. The young upstart John Gotti assassinates the boss of the Gambino crime family in 1985 outside of Sparks Steakhouse. It unleashes a torrent of chaos, and he seizes control, right? So this is a story that anyone who pays attention to sort of organized criminal groups has heard over and over again. So it is the same story, and this
But I suppose the consequences, the volume of death that happens, I suppose the
correct.
weaponry they're using, and the destruction to the foundations of the state of Mexico, and what has been done
Oh,
there is
absolutely. I mean, yeah, I mean, look, I remember one of the first stories I covered as a reporter was a civil war within the Colombo crime family, which is one of the five mafia families. And, like it's the same thing. It sort of split into two factions, and the two factions went to war on the streets of Brooklyn. And over the course of the early 90s, oh, there were probably, I don't know, 15 to 20 murders. And it was like, oh my God, this violent mayhem on the streets of New York City. Well, I mean, this is like thousands of people
mm,
dying, right? This is so like the magnitude of this is so beyond the localized and yet terrible violence that, that civil war created. And of course, the true victims in all of this are like the Mexicans who live amongst these warring clans. They are the collateral damage for sure. And so it's terrible to live with. And all frankly always has been.
So, what about fentanyl? And is it, I mean, it's obviously like putting a finger in a dam whenever pressure is put on any of these groupings, but has the border policies from Trump, the kind of, I suppose, the better relations with Mexico, the crackdown there, has it made a difference?
I actually think it has made a difference. So, Trump applied extreme economic pressure on the Scheinbaum government shortly after President Scheinbaum came into power, mostly through the threat of tariffs. And the Scheinbaum government responded quite quickly by, making, a series of fentanyl seizures, which were real seizures and had a real effect. The border is effectively sealed, right? So
Hmm.
smuggling in, sort of like, outside of ports of entry has become measurably more difficult. The caveat to that, of course, is most smuggling of drugs from Mexico doesn't pass through illegal portions of the border. It passes illegally through legal ports of entry, right?
Right. Hmm.
Um, but I think that too has had an effect. And, you see that fentanyl deaths in this country have gone down, right? And so, could that be tied to the policies of the last 6 months alone? Probably not. But I think that the pressure that Trump has placed on Mexico has had some effect, particularly on fentanyl. And,
Well,
to be clear, Trump also, to give credit where it is seldomly due, but
mhm,
let's give him his credit where it is due. The pressure that Trump put on the Mexican government also led to the return of 29, highly sought after cartel leaders across a gamut of cartels who had been in Mexican custody for a very long time. And while that process had begun, the negotiations to get those 29 top cartel leaders back had begun during the Biden administration. It was carried over the line under Trump. So,
mhm.
and that was
And
not
Alan,
insignificant.
can fentanyl be made outside Mexico? Like, I mean, obviously the cooks or the people with the knowledge of how to put it together, presumably are there in the employ of the cartels. But say, for example, if you had those people in across the border in the US, it, it's possible, presumably, to make it there. Yeah.
Oh, of course. I mean, so the very basics of the fentanyl economy are most of what they call the precursor chemicals, the ingredients, come from China. And so there's been
Mm,
a coincidental push by the Trump administration to apply pressure on China to stop the export, mostly to Mexico, of those precursor chemicals. And then increasingly, the drugs that have been cooked and made inside Mexico. And so, one of the great benefits of synthetic drugs like fentanyl is that you are not reliant upon Mother Nature and the whims of Mother Nature to make your product, right? So if you have a bad season, your poppy crop or your cocaine crop, or they suffer. But when you're just assembling chemicals in a factory, you're just behind closed
mm,
doors. It's easier to protect. It's a chemical process that that the criminals have complete control over.
mhm,
That said, there is some infrastructure that is visible, right? Like there are factories, there are, warehouses. And so, if you're a cartel operative, it's better from your perspective to do that in Mexico because it's easier to sort of protect and disguise or pay off the authorities while you're making those. But there's no reason why
mm.
those same factories or cooking facilities couldn't be located inside the United States. And then you've obviated the need for smuggling across borders altogether.
For sure. And presumably that's the kind of things that I suppose this new grouping of the Jalisco new generation and the Chapitos will be sort of considering if the pressure continues from the US and from internally in Mexico.
Yeah, I know there's an entire infrastructure, a cartel infrastructure inside the United States already. It's mostly geared toward distribution, right? There's the people who receive the drugs, they store them, they warehouse them, and then they sell it, right? It's sales and
Mm,
distrib. It's sort of like it's like reception, storage, sales and distribution. That's traditionally what the arms of the cartel inside the United States look like. But yeah, as you suggested, there's theoretically there's no reason that it couldn't be geared toward production too. It's just you probably need more infrastructure, which increases the risk of detection, right?
mhm.
So,
The grouping again will, whether or not they can all remain friends, it sounds like they have some background there that's going to be challenging for them as they go forward. But it will also presumably be looking for new markets for fentanyl. Um, I know Europe hasn't seen a huge amount of the drug, uh, been scatterings of it, which is sort of believed to have really just been a couple of groupings testing the market with it. But it's certainly we haven't been sort of challenged with it in Europe yet. But you talk about the Sinaloa having, I suppose, distribution centres in the US. They've certainly becoming more and more prevalent in Europe as well. And believe it or not, in Ireland, in
Oh,
Kerry.
I
You know
entirely
this
believe that.
story about the
Yeah,
Salazar connection, just
yes,
extraordinary. I mean,
it
the
is.
last place really you'd be expecting a cell structure like that, but nonetheless. So yeah, is there worries? I mean, you talk about in the article in the New York Times about, this grouping, this joining together of these two groups is going to have really ripple effects throughout the global drug trafficking community. But is that the kind of stuff that Europe maybe needs to be a little bit aware of?
I would say two things. One, when I talk to federal agents, U.S. federal agents who are posted in Europe, um, they often say one of the biggest things they try to tell their European counterparts is just how dangerous fentanyl is economically, right? Because the economic model, lower costs, higher profits, is just so enticing. And of course, the just physical danger that it presents. And they have been raising alarms in Europe for some time, trying to use the American experience with fentanyl as a cautionary tale. That is something that I know for a fact is being
Mm,
communicated to European law enforcement. At the same time, if you just look at like the previous model of how cocaine and how the cocaine traffic spread. So, the cocaine traffic, it just makes sense. If the source of the cocaine was sort of, Colombia to some degree, Bolivia, and then there were, the intermediary companies that were countries that were transshipment countries. It gets to Mexico, it crosses the border into the United States, it is distributed and sold in the United States at great profit. There were also the Sinaloa cartel was also quite successful at creating, as you said, networks in Europe and frankly in Australia. They absolutely penetrated Australia with cocaine. And so why would they not replicate the same structure of the international distribution with a product that is easier to make and can be sold at much higher profit? So to get back to the thing you said just before we got into that conversation, though, there are real risks that the alliance of convenience between the Sinaloa cartel and Jalisco New Generation will, in fact, survive, right? Let's not forget that um, it was the Jalisco New Generation cartel that kidnapped two of the Chapitos. Um, geez, don't ask me to give you the exact year, but basically 5, 6 years ago, they were down in Puerto Vallarta. I think it was Yvonne and Jesus, if I have it right. They were out at dinner. Masked men come in. They kidnap two of Chapo's sons, and who quietly negotiates their release? Mayo Zambada. So there are real not just sort of economic business rivalries at play, but there's like deep interpersonal conflict there
mm.
that has been kind of papered over, and we'll see what happens.
It's hard to see how they could ever trust one another, and ever feel comfortable. Even I noticed they were having to find this sort of alliance took a while to get off the ground because they had to find neutral places to meet, and everybody was obviously super paranoid. It wouldn't
Yeah.
make for easy boardroom meetings, would it?
No, right? Like, do we meet on your turf, on my turf? And so they
Mm.
sought a way to meet on neutral ground. The idea being that neither wanted to give the strategic sort of, or actually tactical advantage to the other, you know? So yeah.
And I suppose, Alan, finally, when it came to the Chapitos, we can see clearly why they've made their alliance. They're under pressure financially and, feeling that they are about to lose their battle, their war against both the state and their rivals. But it's easy to see why they've made the alliance. What benefit does the Jalisco New Generation Cartel? Is it turf territory
Yeah,
or
it's pure
yeah.
economics, right? It's power and economics, right? And really sort of power emerges from economics often in this world. So yes, the Chapitos conceded some of their turf, whether that means they have given up the turf entirely or whether they're merely paying what's often called a tax. I, I don't have like a vision into that level of detail, but there's an economic benefit here, uh, to Jalisco, which is driving things from their side of the equation. Now, what's interesting is that the Chapitos are under extreme pressure, but American law enforcement has not lost sight of El Mencho and Jalisco either. El Mencho's son, in fact, was just sentenced several months ago. He was on trial. He went on trial in Washington, D.C. Um, and like there are pending indictments against the entire leadership of that cartel as well. So, if you deflate the threat from the Chapitos, perhaps you elevate the threat. They may be sort of elevating their own profile,
Mm.
and placing themselves inadvertently into the crosshairs of, U.S. law enforcement. That too remains to be seen.
Indeed, it's all fascinating. Is there big trials coming up then? What about
Well,
Mayo
so
Zambada?
let's
Where's
see.
he
So
at?
we've got the guilty plea for Ovidio Guzman Lopez in 2 days. Joaquin Guzman Lopez is himself slowly working towards some sort of plea. And then Mayo Zambada is on trial. So those two are being tried in Chicago. Mayo Zambada is being prosecuted in Brooklyn, where El Chapo was tried and convicted. And it remains to be seen how that case will be resolved.
He's
You
not going
know,
to take a plea at this stage. He's going to
I
fight it.
mean,
He has to really.
I would be, whether he takes a plea or whether he fights it, he's going to be in jail for the rest of his natural life because the guy's like 78 years old. He's ailing, he's frail. He's going to die in a US prison one way or the other. So, what what he wants to fight it out for what, right? I mean, you might as well spare yourself
Mm,
the ordeal of trial, and maybe by cooperating in the end you can, I don't know, arrange visits with your family and get to see some small measure of compensation, something.
mm,
I mean, look, that would be the wise course. That hasn't happened yet. And the fact is, Mayo Zambada, much like Chapo himself, is the keeper of many secrets, particularly with regard to corruption within the Mexican government. Mayo was always regarded as the sort of savviest political player within Sinaloa. And so he truly has things of value to the United States government. Whether or not that's, I don't think even what he could tell them will ever get him freed,
mm,
before he dies because he's old and frail, but he may be able to sort of make himself more comfortable in his final years should he decide to fully share what he knows. But
Does
there's
Chapo get any visits or anything? Has that regime we spoke about the last time he was in prison calmed down a little bit for him, or is he
I mean,
still? Wasn't he
No, no.
23-hour lockup? Wasn't it? And
Yeah. Chapo is in the harshest, most secure federal prison in the United States, in Colorado. And the only visits he should get are, legal visits. He doesn't get personal visits, period. I mean, that's just the way that prison is set up.
mm,
So, yeah,
yeah, a long, lonely time ahead from
a long,
to,
lonely time
cons-
ahead.
to
Yes,
consider his
yes.
actions. Well, Alan, thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.